Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Duncan. Very excited to be here and to talk about the CERT program. Really excited to see so many people on and so interested in building resiliency within your community. CERT stands for Community Emergency Response Team. It is the premier program from the Federal Emergency Management Agency to not only provide preparedness training, disaster preparedness training to the community, but also as a tool to leverage the local community to build community resilience. And we'll talk a little bit about that during the presentation. If you have any questions about the presentation, don't hesitate to put it into the chat box or raise your hand or ask the moderators to pause me and I can stop and answer any questions and clarify anything. Or if you want to spend a little bit more time talking about a particular subject, we'll also do quite a bit of Q&A at the end of the presentation as well. So as Duncan mentioned, my name is Suu-Va. I work for the State of California in the Governor's Office. I administer the CERT program in California, and we have over 500 local CERT programs. I also led volunteer and donations management in my state for many years, and I'm currently the president of the National CERT Association, an association that was created to work side by side with FEMA to support the over 3,000 CERT programs in the United States. So what is CERT? CERT is 20 hours of classroom-based training to teach an individual or a community or a group of stakeholders, like a family group or a business, on what to do during a major disaster or a mass casualty incident. So you see on the slide, the key skills are teaching fire safety, light search and rescue, team organization, disaster medical operations in a consistent manner with nationally recognized curriculum. The program was started in 1985 at a local fire department. It was following a couple of major earthquakes in Mexico City, as well as in Tokyo, where hundreds of people died trying to save other people who were victims of the earthquake. What we saw was a lot of community members are very eager to jump in and help when a disaster happens, but without proper training, they are putting themselves in harm's way and adding to the casualty count as opposed to helping the survivors. So the Los Angeles City Fire Department developed a program to train community members on disaster safety, disaster awareness, and key disaster skills so that if the disaster happened in front of them, they will be able to act more safely. In 1994, FEMA picked up the program and expanded it nationwide. Prior to that, just like many other programs, it was shared among fire departments, but not in a consistent manner. It was more where you met with coworkers or people you work with, saw a great idea and said, hey, can I borrow some of those concepts? And then you created their own CERT program. So it wasn't the same, and the level of consistency wasn't there. In 1994, FEMA saw an opportunity to really provide a program nationwide and provide funding behind the program. And in 2002, following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, a lot of money was put in to allow for local communities to develop similar programs to CERT. And that's where we saw a lot of growth within the CERT program to over 3,000 programs now. And there are CERT in over a dozen countries around the world. And Paul, actually, who is here with me, has taught and helped quite a few countries, and I've been to quite a few countries helping with their CERT program as well. So what separates CERT training, what defines CERT training is really three major parts. One is that the training is classroom-based. So it's not independent study where you read a lot of words and take a test and feel like you've learned something. You're taught in a classroom environment by qualified instructors who know a lot about the information, but it's also hands-on skills. So as they teach you how to use a fire extinguisher and the different types of fire extinguishers, they're going to put it in the community members' hands and actually have them use it and exhaust the fire extinguisher to put out a live fire during training. We also teach medical operations, how to stop bleeding, how to treat shock, how to evacuate people using different kinds of carries, how to do light search and rescue. And it culminates in a 2 to 3 hour disaster simulation. And this simulation is designed to present a scenario and allow the entire class to break up into teams similar to what would happen in the neighborhood during a major disaster, so you can practice all the skills you just learned, but also practice it in a chronological order to really make it sink in and allow you to build that muscle memory so that when a disaster happens, you're more ready to act. Many CERT programs also do refresher courses. So once a year, they're going to allow the community members who've been trained to come back and retrain in some of these key skills. and really keep appraised on some of the updated technical skills, but also to get better with that muscle memory. During COVID, throughout the United States, a hybrid CERT training was developed. And this training removed some of the lecture-based training and moved it online, but retained a lot of the in-person training, so it's half and half. This allowed for the US to continue to offer CERT training to community during COVID, and also allowed for community members to get some preparedness training. And then once it is safe to do so, and many programs have already started to do this, bring the community members in to do the hands-on training and disaster simulation. It's a little bit longer, so instead of 20 hours for the normal CERT training, it's roughly 28 hours for this hybrid training. But many programs have found it very effective because it casts a wider net, and it also allows for community members who are timid or unsure whether or not they want to commit 20 hours to come into a classroom to really try out one or two modules and see if they really like the content, and then continue on with the training. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the key modules that are presented in CERT training. CERT training is broken into 9 modules. Each module is roughly 2 to 3 hours long, which allows CERT to be delivered in multiple different ways. One way is to deliver it once a week for a couple hours per night. So it's an 8-week period with a 9th week where you do the disaster simulation. Or many programs actually do it 3 days in a row. So they do it Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And some community members really like that a lot, especially when you're delivering to a targeted audience, like a business or a specific group of people, where they can get together and work with each other and really just get it all done really quickly. So the first chapter or first module in CERT basic training is disaster preparedness. This is really an opportunity for programs to localize the training and talk about what the local disasters are, but also talk about how local first responders respond to a disaster. Typically, they talk about how many firefighters there are, and if there's a fire call, how long it takes for a fire engine to get from the station to the incident. They talk about a major disaster, how an emergency operations center works, and how the county and city coordinates with each other and the state, but also highlight some of the major disasters and what you can do to sign up for alerts or make yourself more prepared to withstand a disaster coming up. The second module talks about organization and really talks about in a neighborhood, in a business environment, when you're around other people, how do you organize community members so that you can act more efficiently? When you have 10 people in front of a mass casualty incident, all 10 people are not going to be doing the same thing. You're going to need people to do different actions. So CERT organization talks about all the different actions that need to be done and how to delineate and share some of these responsibilities, very similar to the incident command system that we use in the United States, and it's used in quite a few countries to coordinate disaster response. A lot of programs who will maintain a CERT cadre or cadre of volunteers for disaster response or preparedness activities will also talk about how they organize their CERT team post-training. Now, that is not required, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference between a train and release program and a train and retain program near the end of the presentation. The next 2 modules cover disaster medical operations and really cover triage, how they quickly assess how injured someone is and mark them whether or not they're critical and need immediate attention. And this is really key because it's going to allow the community members to really address the people who need the attention, but also when first responders show up on scene, they'll get a quick recap of the damage and who really needs attention quickly so that it saves time and it can save lives there as well. They also teach how to treat shock, how to stop bleeding, how to do bandaging and splinting, and a multitude of other skills as well. The next module covers disaster psychology and really talks about how to interact with survivors during a disaster, but also how to keep an eye out for your other volunteers who may have been affected by disasters. Key things to say and not to say to comfort somebody, and what to really look out for to see if somebody has an emotional shock, and how to treat that, and really how to treat yourself as well during this module. The next one is a really fun module. This is fire suppression. So many people who have taken CERT training will say that they have a fire extinguisher in their home, but have never learned how to use it and really put it in their hands. And seeing people use fire extinguishers for the first time and doing simple motions as pulling the pin, there's so many people who get so nervous with that and do it incorrectly. So it's really key to put it in their hands and have them really practice using a fire extinguisher to put out a live fire. And we use fire pan and light it on fire and use a real fire extinguisher to put it out. Now, of course, a lot of programs can't use live fire, or the training is done in an area that is not conducive to live fire. In the United States, there are quite a few water-based fire extinguisher setups, as well as laser-based. So you can still practice a lot of the motions without live fire if necessary, but we have found that using live fire really is the best way to practice and really to prepare someone mentally for what to do during a disaster. Now in CERT, we teach that safety comes first. So there's always the buddy system, which is why you see two people in the photos. But we also teach our community members how to assess a situation and know when to leave and know when they can help. So when a fire is bigger than a wastebasket, that's when they have to leave, because a fire can grow really, really quickly and much quicker than you would assume given different environments. So really teaching that safety, as well as during search and rescue, when to enter a building and when not to enter a building. Utility controls is part of the fire module, and this teaches you how to shut off your water or gas during a disaster, when it's safe to do so, and when you should do so. Not to do so blatantly, because if you turn off gas in the United States, only the professionals can come back and turn it back on. So you really have to assess the situation and see if it's necessary for you to turn it off before you go and do so, especially doing so for your neighbors and not just yourself. Oftentimes, we find that local utility companies will come out and present a part of their utility safety training as well, and they're very happy to do so, because teaching community members really just makes their job a lot easier during a disaster. We teach light search and rescue, not urban search and rescue. It's really just how to search your buildings around you where you are, how to first assess whether the buildings are safe to search, and then how to do so safely and effectively, doing a grid search or doing the sticking to the right search, doing with a team. And during this module, we'll also teach cribbing, which is the act of lifting a heavy weight to remove an individual who may have happened to collapse on top of them. We also teach many different carries. So if you have multiple people around you, you can use a blanket carry or a board carry. If it's just yourself, you can use a chair carry. If it's two people, you can use a two-man carry, and really teaches you how to use things around you to support you with that evacuation as well. The last module is terrorism. So in the United States, because of grant funding, we tied a lot of it to terrorism, which is where the 9/11 attacks came in. And really teaching individuals how to recognize those signs and then just calling the authorities, not teaching CERT members to go and apprehend anybody or do anything physical. It's really what are some of the signs to look out for, and then how to contact the authorities when you see some of those suspicious activities. Now, in order to tailor your CERT program, because for the 3,000 programs throughout the United States, depending on where you are, the disasters that affect you will be different. So along with the core 20 hours curriculum, FEMA has developed annexes for each major hazard, and that allows for the individual program to get a lot of information that they can teach on some of these disaster safety protocols. So a program is welcome to incorporate and really tailor their presentation and a lot of their skills around the disasters that affect them, but also to keep in mind that a lot of the community members also travel or move, so to make sure to give them a general base of information as well too. So to start a CERT program, there are a couple of key things that you need. One is you need a program manager. The program manager is responsible for scheduling the training, recruiting the instructors, ensuring that the instructors are teaching properly, securing the training equipment and supplies necessary to teach CERT basic training, as well as recruiting the participants from the community to come and take the training. You also are going to need instructors and a classroom. Once again, CERT is typically classroom-based training, and then you're going to need the training equipment and supplies. A low budget set of training equipment and supplies minus a laptop, projector, and screen to put on training in a classroom will typically range between $500 to $1,000. And that's where you can make a fire pan yourself, buy wooden blocks for cribbing. The medical operations doesn't take a lot of material, so you can really do it really cheaply if you're very crafty. Or if you're well-funded, like a fire department, you can spend up to $10,000 for a set of equipment. And that's usually to buy a very high-tech fire pan training setup, which is maybe $6,000 or $7,000. But there, you can actually, start a CERT program very, very cheaply and inexpensively. So the two types of CERT programs. One is that there's training release, and that's just generally where a organization such as a fire department or police department or emergency services or a school or a church feel like they need to train their stakeholder group and just offer some training. Typically, you'll see this a lot post-disaster. So after a major fire or earthquake, you're going to see a lot of community members ask, what are we going to do if this happened to us? What do we have? What kind of training is available? And that's when you see a lot of CERT programs start. It's because a lot of community members ask during a city hall meeting, town hall meeting, and then the government responded. The second type of program is train and retain. So not only are you training community members, but you're maintaining a cadre because you have a need to have additional manpower to help with preparedness efforts or disaster response efforts. Roughly 50% of the CERT programs throughout the US are train and retain. So half are just train and release and half are train and retain. On average, an average CERT program would deliver 2 CERT trainings per year. So you don't have to deliver training often, but you just have to train 1 or 2 classes per year. And each class typically has between 20 to 45 students in each class, depending on the number of instructors and also the jurisdiction and how many people are interested in the training. When you train and retain volunteers, you also offer quite a bit more training beyond the 20 hours in CERT Basic. Once again, CERT Basic covers a lot of the skills that an individual would need to respond to a disaster. If you're going to retain a volunteer, you're going to teach the skills that you're going to need them to know to utilize them during a disaster response. So typically, and I'll go over this in a little bit, you're going to use CERT for traffic control and shelter operations, EOC support. So you're going to train those skills because those skills are not trained during CERT Basic training. You'll also train them on how to interact with local government and first responders in an efficient manner. But during what we call blue skies, and blue skies in the United States is what we call times when there's no disaster, CERT volunteers can help with preparedness presentations and outreach. They can help with training with community members, not just to re-give the CERT Basic training, but also can do 1-hour trainings that really focus on how to have a safety kit, a checklist, how to have contact information with your family, and how to reunify during a disaster. Small little presentations and small little skills. CERT volunteers are very happy to do that. Many programs also use CERT volunteers to help with admin support in a fire department or police department, and so many CERT volunteers are happy to help out whenever they can in their community. During gray skies, and that's what we call disaster times, here are some of the common activities that CERT volunteers perform: shelter operations, donations management, points of distribution, traffic control, emergency operations support, radio communications, damage assessment, sandbagging in areas that have lots of flooding, and in search and rescue operations. Search and rescue operations, typically it's going to be if there's a missing person, typically someone with dementia or someone with disabilities that has gone missing, and you need a lot of manpower. CERT volunteers are really great at helping with that grid search. FEMA actually just completed a survey that they did with the CERT programs. FEMA typically tries to do an annual survey where they assess the CERT programs to really find out how active they were, how many people they trained, what kind of activities they performed. And during the last set, 380 programs, about 13% completed the survey. So I'm going to go over some of those results because that's going to be key for you to when you're imagining how CERT can help local programs in the UK, because you might be able to see quite a bit of items that I mentioned in the survey where your program can benefit from having a program such as CERT or people trained in CERT. So here is really of the 380 people surveyed where the CERT programs were. And the big circles, the bigger the circle means the more people that were trained. So it goes to show that in the major cities, the San Francisco Bay Area, the LA area, New York area, parts of Florida, where there's high population, you're going to see a lot of training. In the middle of the US, where there's low population, you're going to see a lot less. So typically they're training between 50 people to 100 people per year, but you see still quite a few training within those areas. Here are the types of communities that are served by CERT programs. So CERT programs that serve either a city area, a county area, universities, workplaces, neighborhoods, governments. You'll see that predominantly CERT does serve government jurisdiction because that's where there's some funding as well as there's a purview of government to prepare the community members. But more and more, you're going to see a lot of private sector entities and individual entities that are relying on CERT training to prepare their stakeholders and community members. CERT programs belong to an organization, what we call a sponsoring organization. This organization oversees the CERT program, ensures that they're delivering training correctly, is their conduit to any available grant funding, as well as to the state coordinators and FEMA coordinators. In the United States, roughly 40% of the CERT programs belong to a fire department. Roughly another 40% belong to government, whether it's city government or county government. 11% is law enforcement, and the rest is a mix of other entities. In China, about 95% of the CERT programs belong to a local private sector or NGO, which really funds the CERT program and their efforts, and very little is owned by government, and that's because of the nature of their organization and their hierarchy. So in the UK, you can follow any type of models. Although if you're looking to really roll out CERT in a major fashion, I would definitely recommend a top-down approach, at least in terms of guidance, to ensure the quality of instruction, and also to make sure that if there are any updates to the curriculum that you want to roll out, you can do so at a national level, so that in 10 years, you don't have 200 programs delivering 200 different types of curriculums because they all modified in their own way. Here's the typical audience types for CERT programs. You'll see there's general public, but you see a good amount of teens and youth, as well as faith-based and business. So really any set or any group of individuals who want preparedness training can take CERT training. There's really no age cap or age minimum to take CERT in the United States. We've seen Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts take CERT, cadet programs take CERT. We've also seen CERT in retirement communities as well. Here is a list of some of the additional programs beyond CERT basic training that's being offered by the 380 survey participants. So you see first aid and CPR is the most common training after CERT basic training, but you also see amateur radio, AED, shelter operations. As you go to the right of the list, a lot of it is going to be based on how programs tend to use their CERT volunteers. And decontamination is based on, because of the pandemic, a lot of CERT programs were utilized to support COVID points of distribution, vaccine sites, and decontamination. So that was a skill that was being taught a lot as well. Here is kind of a percentage of the type of events that CERT volunteers are deployed to in 2020. Once again, during the pandemic, that's going to be skewed quite heavily. During non-pandemic years, very little, if any, CERT volunteers are deployed for pandemic. They might help a little bit with flu pods, but there's usually not a pandemic in the United States. But you see wildfire is a major item. Earthquakes, when it does happen, but earthquakes are so rare when it happens that it doesn't make the percentage. It's in the 18% somewhere, along with floods and other disasters. Here are the major activities that CERT volunteers were deployed to in 2020, and you see traffic control management was the major activity. And that's where you use a CERT volunteer to stop community members from entering a disaster site or a dangerous site, or also to help with traffic control and making sure the population and cars continue to move when you have to stop parts of traffic. Here are some major activities that CERT volunteers utilized for COVID. So food pantry support was a huge one in the beginning to really help out with food distribution and helping with the lines. Town hall staffing, helping to usher people to their seats and passing out information, as well as doing presentations. Testing sites, call center support, so answering phone calls and actually calling individuals and communities to provide them with updated information about COVID safety and COVID vaccine information. Distributing PPE in the beginning, giving out masks and other preparedness supplies, and then also creating masks. So in the beginning, a lot of community members, a lot of CERT members were creating masks to give out in the communities because people couldn't afford it, and there was a big shortage of the disposable masks. So people were creating the ones that out of cloth and putting the carbon lining inside to make it reusable as well. Here is the hierarchy of CERT in the United States. So FEMA owns the CERT curriculum and is in charge of updates and top-level technical assistance. They also provide quite a bit of program manager training as well as instructor training to develop people to run CERT programs and deliver CERT training. FEMA then delineates to state coordinators who can then add on additional guidance and information and also additional support to the CERT programs. But CERT programs are ultimately owned by a local agency. So a local program has a CERT program, they can download the curriculum online, and they run their own CERT program, and they don't have to ever interact with FEMA or the states if they don't want to. However, when they have questions or if they want some grant support or want to be connected to other programs, that's when it's important to connect to the other organizations, but it's not necessary to do so. Of course, the programs that are better connected usually do better because they learn a lot more and then they can share in the information communication channel. Before I talk about the steps to bringing CERT to the UK, I do want to mention one other thing. So while in the United States, the 3,000 CERT programs call themselves CERT programs, it's not necessary to do so. If you want to just use the 20 hours of CERT training as a foundation and as a base, and then call your volunteer program something else, or develop some other model within the UK, you can use CERT as a foundation. Similar to if you were to go to university and you take English class and Spanish class, that's just part of your foundation. It came from somewhere, but you don't have to name your college after the curriculum that you borrowed. So with CERT, you're welcome to use parts or all of the curriculum. But if you do want to call yourself a CERT program, there are some protocols we want you to follow and agree to, and that's to ensure that CERT means the same thing everywhere. So if it's CERT in the UK or CERT in the United States or CERT in China, we can imagine the same thing and understand that it doesn't stray too far from the core concept. So the steps to bringing CERT to the UK, whether you want to bring it as official CERT programs or just a curriculum and use it as a foundation, one is you have to really understand what CERT is and find out what you want to use it for and the end result of bringing CERT to the UK. Is it to create volunteer cadres? Is it just to provide curriculum and training to community members who are interested in being better prepared? Is it for another purpose? Is it so that you can have extra manpower within your first responder agencies? In some countries like Chile, where their fire department is 100% volunteers, they are hungry for more volunteer bandwidth. So having CERT programs makes sense in countries like that. Then number two is optional. So you can have an MOU with FEMA, an official MOU if you want. That's going to be very expensive because it's going to involve the lawyers, it's going to involve them coming out to do official training, or you can do an MOU with the National CERT Association, and that's essentially free. And what that means is the NCA will basically sign on behalf of FEMA and really be the conduit to ensure that you're going to provide CERT training in the spirit of CERT. There's a couple of modifications you can make, and we'll work with you on that. But essentially, you'll be able to use a CERT name and call yourself CERT and be recognized as another country that uses CERT training, and also have a communication channel for technical assistance and whatnot, without the funding required as it would be if you had an official MOU with FEMA. You would then need to have program manager training, so having the course to learn how to run a CERT program, how to recruit instructors, how to recruit community members for their training and volunteers. You're going to have to see the original CERT basic training so you can see from beginning to end what that looks like. And then also take the trainer-trainer course. So having your potential instructors go through a 3-day instructor development course to learn how to teach the CERT basic training. The last three you can do if you have qualified instructors, or you can work with the NCA. And if you have, let's say, travel funds to bring over a cadre of instructors, we can, for 1 or 2 trips, send a team of experts pro bono to provide this training. And of course, if you want ongoing training, we can work out an agreement for that as well too. But that's the basic steps of bringing CERT to another country and CERT to the UK. I'm going to pause here and answer any questions you might have. Actually, before I do, Paul, do you have anything else to add?
Hi. Yeah, I just want to say really quickly that I've been involved with taking CERT to 8 other countries, primarily Brazil. And this is a fantastic program that can be very well contextualized and localized. So as we're doing here in New Zealand at the moment, fixing the spelling and all those things, but it's actually really adaptable for different conditions and countries. So you can, needless to say, I am a big fan of the CERT curriculum. That's all I have to say at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Suu-Va, Paul. Every time I hear about CERT, I learn a little bit more and a little bit something different. Lisa, I can see that there's a lot of comments in the chat, and I just encourage people to put comments or put some questions into the chat. Lisa, I wonder if there are any themes emerging that would lead to some questions for Suu-Va and Paul.
Not especially themes, I wouldn't say, Duncan, but there's certainly some really good questions in there. First is from my buddy in Kent, is from Steve Scully, with a very pertinent question, which I will add a little add on to it. He's asked about how insurance cover is arranged, and I would add on to that the safeguarding and security checks, because that's always a bit of a tricky one with volunteers. And I was wondering, the question there around insurance and safeguarding security checks, about how that's done with CERT. and also insurance?
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about how it's done in the U.S., and then Paul can talk a little bit about what he's seen internationally. So in the U.S., there are a couple of ways to handle volunteer insurance. One is some states will actually offer a liability insurance coverage for affiliated volunteers. So volunteers that are affiliated with the government CERT program and have been deployed officially to support government and disaster response or activities. So California has the type of insurance policy, and Florida and a couple of other states have it, but it's not universal. So it's not mandatory for a state to provide this kind of insurance coverage, but this really allows for a lot more local programs to utilize their CERT volunteers without additional cost to them. The second way is for a local program to provide insurance to the volunteers. Because many CERT programs are attached to a public safety agency, they typically already have insurance for their first responders and or their admin staff. So typically they would add the CERT volunteers to their policy for a very minimal cost, and this will provide coverage for the CERT volunteers when they are deployed or when they're doing training. The third way is for the CERT volunteers themselves to provide their own insurance. So CERT volunteers are so passionate that in many CERT programs that don't provide this, in order for them to be utilized, they're willing to pay for their own annual insurance policy. So they'll band together and they create a 501c3 organization, which allows them to fundraise, and then they'll purchase a policy. And you can buy policies in the United States for as low as $400 that will cover a whole CERT team throughout an entire year. And then the last way is if there's no funding, the programs will ask the volunteers to sign a waiver. So they're basically acting at will and will not hold the organization liable if they get injured during a disaster. That is not ideal, but that has been done. So those are the different ways. Now, in the United States, we also have the Good Samaritan law, which means that a Good Samaritan, an individual who's trying to help out in good faith, cannot be sued if they injure somebody or do something wrong in the act of doing so. That's not available everywhere, so you got to be careful of CERT volunteers who try to do good, but we all know that not everyone can be saved, and so people can be very litigious, and even if there's no fault of the volunteer, they might want to see a quick payday and just sue for the hell of suing, and so that's what you have to look out for. But in most cases, many departments, they say that it is worth that kind of liability, especially to the HR department, for the amount of bandwidth and amount of support that they can have from the CERT volunteers, because many local jurisdictions have emergency management staff of one, right? They have very few firefighters and very few first responders who are very busy during a disaster. So having people that they can train and rely on during a disaster that will come and take off time from work during a disaster and come and help save the day really makes a big deal, and really is part of their emergency plan, right? They really rely on this extra team of 20 to 30 individuals that can really come and be utilized during a disaster, so they're willing to take those risks or willing to pay the premium of their insurance policy.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Later on in the chat, people have made the point that volunteers tend to fall under the responsibility of local authorities. So that's another way to move forward, is because you've got the response, they're supporting emergency services, it's a slightly different tack, whereas in the UK they do tend to fall under local authority responsibility. But yeah, it's an interesting one about who we're actually supporting when it comes to response, particularly for CERT. So yeah, second questions on there. I'm just trying to move back up the chat, which is around how is the training advertised? And it says, do you find trends in exams in terms of take up? I think you've probably covered that on one of your slides around who are the people you tend to get to. Are recent emergencies a catalyst, as in, you know, that surge of volunteer for like COVID, we've had a surge of volunteers for that. And is there that societal piece in there? Who is more likely to get involved? Is wealth a factor, or is it deprivation? How is that piece? So three bits there. How do you advertise? Is there kind of a catalyst for engagement? And who do you find, you know, that from society, who are your most your prevalent volunteers from?
So Paul, why don't you answer this first, because you worked in other countries, and we can talk about how the other countries advertise CERT and what are the common community members that get involved, and then I'll talk a little bit about the United States.
Thanks. It's very different depending on the location. Often we've been working with non-government organizations. So most of the countries I've worked in, we've started working alongside a non-government organization, and they are either advertising to existing members, or in a number of situations has actually been post-impact. So we often find people are really keen on hearing about resilience after an event. So we've gone into landslides in Rio or dam collapses in southern Brazil and other countries as well. And as part of the recovery phase, or the response to recovery phase, we've come in and provided CERT to communities. It seems to be almost counterintuitive, but one of the best times, and also helps with the psychosocial recovery and other aspects as well. So that's often one of the best times. Another incredibly useful technique we've found has been Teen CERT, particularly in schools. Again, Rio de Janeiro, that was very well received, as that also offers other training. I think one of the big things about CERT is, in any resilience training, is finding people that want this training to meet other needs. Often, rather than trying to get a group together to do something they may not want to do, but when we find communities and groups and situations we come and offer this training, we find there's a really good uptake.
Thank you, Paul.
Great.
So in the United States, there are a couple of methods to advertise, and advertise it and finding people who are interested in taking CERT training, as well as interested in being a volunteer, is not easy. And you really need to really have somebody that's passionate and skilled in this arena. Otherwise, you can have the best equipment and supplies, the best instructors, and no one shows up to your class. When you first start out with a CERT program, the key is to really find the demand first, right? You wouldn't start a CERT program unless there was a need in your local community to have this kind of training, or to have a pathway for people to volunteer. Usually, if you promote this training at your city council meetings or your town hall meetings, those are where you find the people who are most engaged in the communities, community leaders, but also people who want to do something. You also want to find community groups, schools. You want to find clubs, different groups of people that already have a reach. And so you basically are talking to the leader of the group, and they'll bring in a good amount of their members into that training. You also can advertise at preparedness events. So in the United States, many local jurisdictions will either have an annual preparedness fair, or they'll have an annual carnival where they'll have a booth to talk about preparedness and allow for people to sign up for training. So typically you'll schedule a training after one of these major events, because you'll have a lot of people who sign up during that time. Because you're only delivering on average 1 or 2 CERT trainings per year in most instances, you can actually have a long period to sign people up and get interest. And then you got to make sure to re-engage them before scheduling a class. So emailing them. We have found that if you call people to remind them of training, you're going to have a much better success rate of people showing up than if you didn't. And also, when you are trying to create a cadre, so if you say, hey, my goal is to have 30 volunteers who I can call on for disasters, you will not get those 30 volunteers in your first training class. The key is to do it slowly and say, hey, I'm going to have a training with 30 people, and I'm going to offer it. And maybe if I come away with 5 people who are interested, that's successful. And then I do another training, I get another 5, right? You don't want to start with 30 people anyway, because for you to mold 30 people to really see and share your same vision for what a program is, it's going to be hard. But for you to get 4 or 5 people to really be in line with what you want to do with CERT, and then for them to help you influence and mold the new people coming in, it's going to be a lot easier than to try to get 30 people to all agree at the same time. So I always say, don't jump in with a 1-year plan. It's a 5-year plan. And even just having 5 volunteers in 1 year from now is such a huge help if you have 0 volunteers, because these 5 people can dedicate so much time. Some volunteers are basically full-time volunteers. There are a lot of people who are retired or don't have to work, and this is kind of where they have found their niche in life. They say, hey, I can really fulfill myself by being a part of my CERT program for my community. I interact with people who are like this all the time. During our major fire 2 years ago in California, we had people who are 600 miles away take time off of work during the holidays to come up to volunteer to clean pet cages, because this was their passion, and they took time off of work for a highly paid job just so that they can help out with volunteering. So you're going to find a lot of these kind of people, but you have to put in the effort to find them. Advertising on websites, at schools, at supermarkets where people will convene is also very helpful. And right now, because of the pandemic, handing out information as people are picking up supplies and getting vaccinations or whatnot, it's very helpful because people are now more hungry for training. The only part about the pandemic is that the in-person portion is going to be unsafe to do so in many areas. But you're welcome to also use the hybrid CERT training and roll out the online portion if you want. And that's, once again, 12 hours of independent study, and then roll out the in-person portion afterwards. FEMA also has a IS 317 course, so it's I think right now the 4-hour online CERT Lite course. So it really introduces a lot of the concepts of CERT, and that might be a good way for you to recruit people too, is really share that far and wide. And then if people see that and are interested, that's when they'll move on. But generally, you're going to find 1% of the population will be passionate about this space, and then the rest are going to be too busy, don't have the time, or don't care about preparedness to be involved. So it's a huge numbers game. You're not going to be able to talk to 100 people and find 50 people that are going to be interested. If you talk to 100 people to find 2 or 3 people who are interested, you're just going to need to talk to a lot of people or get your flyers out to a lot more people.
Thanks, Suu-Va. Thanks, Paul. I see a question from Mark Sawyer about success criteria. Mark, I wonder if you could come off mute and explain the question, please.
Yeah, very happy, and thank you for the opportunity as well. I think the key, just from what I was just hearing, is clearly maximising existing networks, relationships, etc., and using that as the basis upon which starting to roll this out. What I'm interested in is what criteria FEMA and others have utilised when initiating the programmes in terms of success, because we know very well that how do you measure success in terms of community resilience? This does take a lot of time, potentially resource, some initial financial contributions, etc. And it will be interesting to gain a view in terms of what success looks like.
Sure. So a couple of ways. One is you can measure it by the percentage of your population that has been prepared. So LA City, which has a population of 6 to 8 million people, have maybe trained 100,000 people, in the 35 years. They train 3,000 to 6,000 people per year, which is a huge number. Because of the number of people in their city, you can really only train a small percentage, a small fraction. But once again, you don't need to train everybody in your community. If there's 10 people in a group during a disaster, if one of them knows what to do, they can now leverage the other 9 people. So that's what a lot of communities want, is they want to be able to say, hey, I would love to have at least one CERT person in each neighborhood block. Have at least this percentage of people who are trained in CERT, so that on average, if something happens, somebody is trained. So that's a measurement. The other measurement is to meet the demand. So if there are more people signing up for CERT than you can accommodate, then you might want to add additional training. So if you say, hey, every year we put it out and 70 people sign up, if you can train 70 people, we're very successful. We have met the demand. If you can only train half the people that are interested, then you might want to say, hey, can we add resources to train more people because of the huge interest, or can we only train this many? Sometimes you can't meet demand, which is fine. It's great. That means you're very successful in your marketing, but because you can use volunteer CERT instructors and civilian CERT instructors, there's really no reason to not deliver more CERT training, because each additional class doesn't cost a lot of money. There's only very few consumables in terms of printouts or supplies that you utilize that you need to repurchase. Otherwise, if you have instructors who are pro bono, volunteer instructors, and you have the classroom set up already, there's really very little cost per CERT class. It's really the cost to be able to deliver CERT training is going to be the biggest barrier. The last thing I'll mention is annual reports. So CERT programs that have a volunteer cadre will have an annual report that shows the number of volunteer hours contributed by their volunteers, whether it's part of training, part of preparedness efforts, part of disaster efforts. They'll add that up and they'll show the value. So in the United States, it's very common to multiply a manpower hour by 20 and say, hey, if we average it and say this person was worth $20 an hour, what was the value to the program? And many programs will show $100,000, $200,000 in return from the volunteer hours, and say, hey, it only costs us this much to put on a CERT program in terms of staff time and cost, but we're getting this much return. And so that could be very successful too. FEMA says that each human life is worth about $2.7 million. So if FEMA can pump $2.7 million to save a life, whether it's through preparedness efforts or mitigation efforts, that is successful. Now, I don't know how they got that number because an individual doesn't make $2.7 million in their lifetime. So how do they offset that cost? But that's basically the value they have put on a life in a lot of presentations that I've seen. And this was a couple of years ago. But they are basically saying $2.7 million is what we will invest. And if we can save one life, it was worth it. So that's really some of those metrics that we use. I don't know, Paul, if you have any other metrics to mention.
A lot of the NGOs, humanitarian organizations, obviously count more the people who've done the training. A lot of it's more like the catch and release type model, and also obviously doing skills assessments or pre-post tests to get some idea of what skills have been learned by that population. So I guess you're just measuring the increase in community resilience.
While we wait for the next question, I'm going to put the website for FEMA CERT website in the chat box. And that's where you can download a lot of materials, watch a bunch of videos, and really learn more about the CERT program.
Great, thanks, Suu-Va. And next, there are a number of questions. I'm trying to get a theme out of here. So there's one in particular, and Matthew and James have put some remarks on around British Red Cross. Matthew's very pointedly made the point that in the British Red Cross have 2,000 trained crisis responders and 85,000 reserve volunteers, and that's that question around how we bring together, I think, what we've already got in this country under the one umbrella. And then there's a kind of a linked question further down, which is around how you've then linked what you're doing with CERT to those kind of groups that already existed. Do you find that they are kind of willing to come under the CERT umbrella, or do you find that there is still fractions and people? How do you link to those that are already existing if they remain independent, I suppose, or are they quite willing to come under the CERT umbrella when you're putting that in locally?
So that's a great question. There's two major aspects of this. One is there are quite a few organizations that have their own volunteer cadre that utilize CERT training, and they don't change their name to CERT. They may say it's the Civil Air Patrol CERT team. So they would use CERT to denote the group, subsect within their bigger group, right? The CERT program within the Boy Scouts, they'll say that, and maybe that's their deployment arm. So they have a bigger group that does other things, but what they use for disaster response, they'll call their CERT team. The reason why they like to use CERT is because that's recognizable. When they offer their services during a disaster and they tell government, hey, I have a team of people that can help out, they typically will get a no, because government's like, we don't need more spontaneous volunteers. They're untrained and unskilled. We don't need them. So if they say, hey, we have a CERT team that we can send, they're like, oh, great, send us your CERT team, right? Because they understand what CERT means. So that's the value of keeping a name with some recognition. If you have a lot of programs already, so you have 85,000 reserve volunteers across the UK, if they're all within a similar type of program, I would say don't take the CERT name. Maybe see how CERT is utilized and works with each other, with local government, and maybe adopt some of those concepts and say, hey, we want to be able to assimilate with our government response, similar to how CERT does in the United States. Here's what they do. Here's the communication flow. Here's the training. Here's the responsibility. Here's how we request CERT teams and deploy CERT teams. We are just going to change it from CERT to our program, and that's totally fine. You don't need to change your program, and it's going to, I would definitely not, because you're going to make a lot more enemies by usurping the current established program with a new program that they don't know. So you lose a lot of people who have a lot of passion and identity with that already named program, and then you're going to now have to fight and recruit new people to this. Why would you want to do that? Now, if you don't have an established network and it's 85,000 people, but within 8,000 different programs, that's a different story. That's where you might say, okay, we need to create a model program that people can fall under. So you're not creating CERT, you're basically creating a template and say, hey, we're creating a disaster response program within the UK network, and it requires X, Y, and Z. And if you fit X, Y, and Z, you can basically be stamped as this kind of program. You can still do your own thing, but you're basically, when we say, hey, we're deploying this kind of program, you're basically typing a resource, just like you're typing a strike team for fire response, right? It could be a bunch of firefighters but they don't have the same training or the same kind of engine. You're not going to request a same kind of team. You want to be able to know what you're requesting and know what's showing up. And it's going to be a lot easier for you to train your emergency managers on how to interact with these volunteer resources if there's some kind of standardization. So definitely don't replace it if you don't need to. Look at what your current availability is and resources are, and then see how you can adopt that model and assimilate that model into your disaster response, and whether adding the name CERT means something or not is going to be something you have to decide later on.
Okay, thank you. And kind of linking to that, which is around achieving the same objectives but with slightly different models. James asked a question around conflicts between strategic objectives in countries who embed it versus operational, and how those are managed. I guess particularly when it comes to perhaps sort of getting funding for things, because sometimes the government focus might be different from what local focus might be, and how we approach that applying for funding, but also what those objectives are too.
Paul, do you want to go first since you've worked in other countries a little bit more?
Yeah, sometimes I think the whole attraction of CERT, the idea of running around with the hard hats on and all of that, can attract people to the program, but the actual benefits can be other. So, for example, in Rio de Janeiro schools, the big benefit was probably the fact we were training them in basic first aid and psychosocial skills. So sometimes you can get funding for the program not because it is a response program, but because it meets other objectives. So I think that's very valid. In fact, I think the way the CERT program is designed makes it attractive to certain groups, but can then actually, they're signing up to be first responders, so they think, but they're learning other skills that can meet other objectives. So you could sell the program sometimes on other objectives rather than just looking at a response type training. I think that's all valid. The benefits of the program are multiple.
Yeah, so in some countries, once again, United States, because CERT programs are so heavily attached to a fire department, police department, or any first responder agency, it's a different model. But in China, and other countries that I've worked in, it's almost entirely funded locally. And what you typically would do is find a private sector entity or NGO that feels invested in the community and in the community stakeholders that they want to invest, right? Usually companies want to do that because in the community are their employees and their customers. And many private sector companies, you can use a write-off, and they're basically donating money to prepare the local community. And preparedness is very sexy to private sector entities. They like to be able to say they are supportive of government and supportive of disaster response, especially when there's major disasters or you're in a country that has lots of major disasters. They get a lot of goodwill by saying that they donate to this. And it's very minimal how much they need to donate. A couple $1,000s per year can maintain a CERT program just fine. I've seen CERT programs beyond the initial investment of equipment and supplies can run on a couple $100s per year, because you can really run on a almost 100% volunteer core, finding people who are volunteers to manage the program, finding people who are volunteers to instruct the program and helps with the instruction. And then obviously these people are your deployment capacity as well. Now, there are, once again, many different CERT programs, and some CERT programs will have a full-time staff that is managing the CERT program. Sometimes they have a part-time staff that will do it. Many fire departments will use firefighters to teach CERT basic training, but you don't need to, right? It's not designed to need first responders or need a high level of capital to be able to carry out the CERT training. It's really finding the equipment and supplies, and you can maybe even get that donated. A lot of CERT programs will get their fire extinguishers donated because they expire. So when you go to organizations, even fire departments, and say, hey, when your extinguisher expires, can you donate it to us? Because just because they expire doesn't mean it doesn't work. And when you're just practicing with it, an expired fire extinguisher is just fine. They typically expire after 2 years. So if you just visit businesses every 2 years, you have an unlimited supply of free fire extinguishers. And then once again, seeing about getting donations, but also don't discount your community members. Some successful CERT programs will ask the community members to donate as well too, because when you bring in a community, you have people who are lawyers and business owners and construction owners and whatnot, and then they might be able to donate, or they're willing to write a check to support your local program. So not only are you training them, you're also, you have a little flyer that says, hey, if you can donate or support and supplies, here's what we need for our CERT program. And you'll find people who are willing to donate and be very passionate about this type of area.
Just looking at the chat, I can see Joanne Lloyd's asked the question. Joanne, I wonder if I could ask you to come off mute if you're happy and ask a question about Scouts and links into some of the youth groups that we have.
Yes, I'm new to this work area, but I do have experience working with the police and with youth groups. My sort of comment and question was, do you have a model, or have you had success with recruiting via already organised youth groups? For instance, obviously in the UK, we have Cubs and well, more so Scouts and Rangers, but we have a very large, what I believe to be an untapped resource of military cadets, Royal Air Force, Army and Sea Cadets. So, and these organisations are huge, and also a Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, which is run through military organisations and schools and colleges, which engages youths from about 14 years upwards, up to age of 25. And obviously that generation are going to be the ones who are going to be passing all this knowledge and training on. Obviously not forgetting the elder, like you said, there's no age range. However, we have, I think that's an untapped resource, because it, alongside the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme or some of the other programs that these cadets run, this could fit in really well with a lot of the programs of training that they do. Do you have any sort of experience of bringing those on board?
Yeah, actually, youth CERT is pretty successful. So there's a lot of cadet programs in the United States, and Boy Scouts and Girl Scout programs. A lot of high schools offer CERT training as well. So there's two ways to offer training to the youth. One is to allow them to take part in the regular training. So they would show up with their parents, with a guardian, and they can be part of the regular class and take the regular training. And the second one is to have a class targeted specifically to that group. So a Boy Scout group, a cadet group, which can be more fun for those young individuals, because now they're working with each other and everything. The training is the same. So we don't dumb down or reduce the training for a youth group. We do make sure that there's a lot more safety measures, and we also make sure they're trained in it, but not necessarily encourage them to do a lot of these skills during a disaster, right? You're not going to ask a 12-year-old to do search and rescue. But the reason why we still do the same curriculum is because very quickly they become 18-year-olds, right? In 4 years, they're 18-year-olds. But also because, like you mentioned, Joanne, they are the conduit to their parents and their guardians, so that when you show them the skills, they're very hungry to go home and say, hey, Mom, let me show you how to use the fire extinguisher. Hey, Mom, do we have a preparedness kit, right? And in the United States, we say there's a role for CERT for everybody, even if you are on a wheelchair or have other disabilities, because you don't have to do the action yourself. You can now supervise or tell someone what they need to do, right? You can be the safety monitor during a disaster too. So a young person who learns how to do triage can remind somebody how to do it, or tell them, hey, you need to do this now. And so they can be very useful there as well. The hard part, though, is just like I say with marketing, some programs just don't know how to market to the youth community, because it's not just putting up flyers. They don't respond to flyers like people like we do, right? We see a flyer, read what's in it. You have to go on social media to reach out to them. You have to go to where they are to reach out, and your flyer has to be something different, right? Something catches their eye differently than what catches our eye. So you really have to know how to reach out to these individuals, and you also have the extra dynamic of not liabilities, but concern from parents. So you have to make sure the parents understand exactly what the kids are getting into. You might have to allow the parents to show up and just be part of the training as well, and just to be in the other room or whatnot. But if you have established groups like Boy Scouts, getting with a team lead, they're always hungry for additional training, additional merits and opportunities they can offer to their groups. So something like CERT is very useful for them. And I see a lot of programs approach us and say, how do we get involved? Or where can we find a local CERT program to provide us with the training? The hard part, once again, is meeting that demand, because the programs are really set up to only offer 1 or 2 trainings per year. A Boy Scout group might say, we want 4 trainings per year because we have that many troops, right? So they're like, well, that's already double what we can offer per year. How do we meet that demand? Because we have volunteer instructors that don't have a lot of time, or our paid instructors don't have a lot of time. But if you can meet that demand, yes, they are great. And youth preparedness is one of the priorities in local government as well as FEMA in the United States.
Brilliant, thanks, Suu-Va. A couple of questions, really trying to link them in. Really, a really good question from Nicola. I'm going to ask Nicola to come off mute and ask her question wider, but it also links to, she's asked about how we how to work with everybody moving in the same direction, I guess, and how actually a very good one from my point of view, working with the voluntary sector, is how to get the uniformed emergency services to take those volunteers seriously. But also a key thing is linking them in with them, particularly kind of mid-response, but also maintaining command and control. So we're all heading in the same direction, how that links into your formal structures of what we're doing for command and control, and how CERT links into that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
fascinating discussion. Thank you. Yeah, fascinating discussion. Thank you, everyone. I was reflecting that down in Somerset, where I am, we've got quite a good network of organised volunteers. And like other people have said, at the start of the pandemic, suddenly we had lots of volunteers, community volunteers coming out of the woodwork, which is brilliant. But there's several issues. One, the insurance one is well covered in the chat. How do you... for very much community good neighbour schemes, they can always sort of get on with it. But anything beyond a sort of very localised good neighbour scheme, they really need to be linked into the organised response. And of course, we should be putting communities at the heart of our emergency planning. We absolutely should. But in the heat of battle, when you're faced with an emergency, that's not the time to do it. So for me, there's a really good read across with this and with community resilience. And emergency response, and it's how we inspire people to join, how we link with the existing groups, because we don't want to offend anybody who's been working away with their own local group, how we have some sort of consistency of standards so that the emergency services know that they can rely on a community to be able to do task sheets or something. And then it's making sure that in a big emergency that everybody's pulling in the same direction, and Jessup principles for the UK people on the call. How can we fold the community volunteers into Jessup? There's something for me about very localised command and control. I don't have any answers. I've got lots of questions, but one question I would throw in is I think we've got almost too many overlapping systems, because we've got the VCSEP voluntary, VCSEP national scheme linking in Red Cross and some of the big voluntaries. We've got local LRF based emergency voluntary groups, and then we've got community volunteers. I think CERT is a brilliant tool, but I think we've got a problem to solve about coordination and governance, being very local authority about things. Thank you.
Yeah, there's actually a pretty easy fix to that coordination thing, no matter how complicated your government is. You basically have all your CERT resources report to one point of contact in the government realm, right? In the first responder realm. It's typically going to be the volunteer coordinator who's going to be activated during a disaster and is in charge of finding resources to plug in to some needs. So instead of saying, hey, you 10 people, you guys will have to learn what CERT is and work with these CERT teams, it's the one volunteer coordinator that is the one recruiting the CERT programs to send their teams, and then giving them their assignments and assigning them their field supervisor or whatnot. But you have one person who really knows what CERT is and how to best leverage the resources and can utilize the resources and then bring them in to the EOC environment or the incident command post in the field. You also make sure that the CERT volunteers understand that even within the CERT, so we teach in the CERT structure, you have a team leader within CERT. So if you have 10 individuals, someone's going to be designated as a team leader. You also have someone who is maybe in charge of plans and someone in charge of logistics, but that's just within their group. So if the CERT team says, hey, we need some bandages to do what we need to do, the logistics person will find out how to get bandages. But that team leader is the only person that will interact with any first responder, right? So we always say, within a CERT team, if a first responder shows up, whoever that first responder is, they now become the supervisor to that CERT team until another supervisor is appointed. So that CERT team now works for that one first responder, and they fall in line. So they don't operate with autonomy. They basically now will operate based on what that first responder needs them to do within the scope of what they're trained to do, right? You make sure that your CERT volunteers sign a code of conduct so they understand exactly what they're signing up for and what they are to do during a disaster. It also allows you to excuse them. So if they fall out of line, they get excused. And you'll find that many CERT volunteers, they want to do the right thing. They want to follow orders, but you have to make it very clear for them. Otherwise, you can't blame them for doing things that you didn't want them to do. It's just like kids, it's like employees. You can't reprimand somebody unless you tell them exactly what to do, what not to do. But once you tell them what to do, you can definitely keep them in line. And going back to having that one point of contact, that makes it a lot easier and for your first responder system to accept using CERT volunteers, because a lot of times the resistance to using volunteers is the unknown. They're like, well, these guys aren't trained, we don't know what they're going to do, are they a liability? Well, let's say, okay, so you're going to deal with them. If I need some people to do stuff, I'm going to ask you, and you're going to send me people, and then I can deploy them. That's all. That's easy, right? So typically, what will happen is within the EOC, you'll say, hey, we need some CERT volunteers to do traffic control. Great. Let's call the volunteer coordinator. Tell them we need 10 volunteers to show up at this time to do this activity, to report to this person. That's all I need to do. I call Paul, and Paul says, great, I'll get you the 10 volunteers. And then he handles it as a volunteer coordinator, and the volunteers show up and do their activities. And then if you need them the next day, they'll be there next day, or they go away. So that's typically how you respond. You treat them as just better trained, spontaneous volunteers in most cases. In some cases where you have very little bandwidth with paid first responders, you might actually train your CERT people to really fill in those roles. But that's no different than training someone that you're paying. You're not paying them, but you're saying, hey, we need you to fill this role because we don't have anyone on paid staff that's going to do this during a disaster. And so you're training CERTs and you're counting on them to come in and do that. That's very rare, and that's usually going to be in areas that really rely on volunteer first responders anyway, to really rely on the volunteer CERTs to show up during a disaster and fill those duties. Paul?
Yeah, can I just throw in? Yeah, something that came out of the Christchurch earthquakes here in Christchurch and in New Zealand. Of course, we had so many spontaneous groups and emergent groups popping up. One of the things that's come out of this is a model we're calling community emergency hubs. Basically, it's the idea of predetermined physical locations where communities can self-organize, but they have a defined link back into the local EOC. So what we're doing, for example, at the moment, back with the folk of Brazil, we're getting them to, they're looking at implementing the hub model, because that provides you with a physical location. Because the problem these days is communities will self-organize. It's not a problem, it's amazing. They will be spontaneous, but we do not have links to those groups at the moment. However, if they can organize around a physical location and a defined link into the EOC, the rest of it will sort out and we'll get that the command control structure plugged into the community. So what we're working with is now to see how CERT groups could plug in at the hub level, and then they're plugged into the EOC structure. Just another way of doing it, given the fact that we don't know what groups will emerge or be on the ground following a major event.
Thank you both, that's brilliant. And a couple of people have made the point, it's around working together beforehand and having those exercises with those partners before we move into actual response. Brilliant questions. We're going to have to draw a line to that because we are running over. So I'm going to hand back to Duncan to pull things together for us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Lisa, for organising that for us. Ray, you've got the absolutely unenviable task of pulling all of this together in 2 or 3 minutes. Good luck.
Well, I'm not even going to try. I am very aware that I stand between you going home and your tea, and I suppose for Paul to get his breakfast. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you very much. It's a really interesting discussion took place. Great engagement from the questions, and it just showed really how much interest there is in the subject. Great engagement all across the piece. What struck me about the programme itself, very structured programme. I'm aware of a range of similar type programmes, but they're not in a structured manner taking place. So that really interested me. The classroom-based learning and what to do in a range of major emergencies was certainly something that I think we need to explore further. I was struck by the modular design of the programme, with where appropriate the practical element. I was really thought that was very, very useful. I just looking here, so suppose there's a number of questions remain. I think there's great interest in this, and there is, to me, an opportunity here to look at this. How could we extend this, or take either in whole or in part across the whole of the UK? Is there an appetite to do that? I'm taking from some of the discussions here, there's certainly an interest, but as how we move this forward, I think is the question that we need to explore a little bit further. And I think there's further work to be done on this, Duncan. I'll go back to you on that too. But I certainly feel that there's an interest. I hope we'll capture that. Certainly when you look at the questions, and I have a huge number of questions I would like to ask myself, but I feel certainly we've been doing this perhaps not as structured as that program, and I think there's an opportunity to take this forward. So let's go for tea.
Thank you.
Back to you, Duncan.
Thank you very much, Ray. I think I think Grace provided a really good summary there of what my thoughts were. I think one of the next steps, Ray, might be to take it into the consortium to talk about some of the other initiatives that we've got going on in the UK already. We see a lot of them mentioned in the chat, from Bedfordshire, from British Red Cross, Northants, and other programmes that share the CERT name, as well as activities that are going on in Salford and Cumbria, all across the countries. How can CERT potentially complement some of those, bearing in mind what Suu-Va said about perhaps not adopting the same some of the rigidities of CERT, but learning from these good practices. And this was what it was meant to do, bringing these different experiences from other parts of the country, other parts of the world, sorry, to bear on this conversation that we're having in the UK at the moment. I would like to thank Suu-Va and Paul for really taking us through some of the really interesting aspects of that. Thank you so much for your time. Lisa, thank you for controlling, managing the chat function. I've only realized how difficult that is, and I'm incredibly grateful, very grateful to Ray for bringing it all together. This is the consortium's trying to involve different people, and hopefully we'll involve others as in the next webinar, which is on the 24th of November. So I'd just like to close there. Thank everybody so much for their time today, and I look forward to continuing the conversations with you. Thank you very much.